Okay, advanced procrastinators, welcome back. We are looking today at the Vietnam War, day 3, and the second half of the war. And basically, what we're looking at today, what is going to make the Vietnam War different and have more resonance than any other war in American history. So, number one, we'll be looking at why young Americans were the first and most adamant group against the Vietnam War. We'll be looking at the Tet Offensive and explain why that event eventually started convincing Americans that the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. And we'll be looking at the behavior and actions of U.S. government in relation to the ideals that this country believes in. Okay, so let's start here with the anti-war protests, right? The 60s is infamous for having the hippies and young people speaking their mind. And what it really begins with, before even the hippie movement begins, is the anti-war protests begin on colleges as young people begin to speak out against the war. Now, the foundation of this movement really comes from a group called the Students for a Democratic Society. Okay, it's called the New Left Movement. And these are protesters at colleges, young people going to school who are recognizing the fact that corporations, special interest groups, and the government has taken over America. America is no longer a country that's for the people, by the people, but young people are starting to interpret the change in America that America is a country for corporations, by corporations, for profit. Right. So these students feel that American voters have very little influence in how the country is being run in the 1960s. And the Vietnam War is just one of those instances where young people felt they did not have much say in the war. So from 1965 to 1967, protests against the war began to spread in colleges around the nation. So keep this in mind. It's young people starting these protests against the war. Now, why would it be young Americans who are most inclined to mistrust the government and the war? And are they correct to protest? And the question we'll be looking at here today throughout the whole thing yes, the young people were inclined to protest against war because they were going to be the ones who would be victims of the war. It's young people being sent to Vietnam, not older people making the decisions, right? And young people at this time, as I said, with the New Left movement, do not believe or trust older people, corporations, special interest groups, right, to make the right decisions for them, right? So for young people, are they correct to protest? They saw this as a fight for their lives in a lot of ways. So what you have is you have lots of anti-draft protests, right? A lot of Americans would burn their draft cards, or even 10,000 Americans went to Canada rather than fight. Now, if you chose not to fight, you said, well, I'm not going to go to war, um, you would be sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison. So it's either 13 months in Vietnam or 5 years in jail. Now, evaluate if those Americans that fled or refused to fight, were they cowards or were they heroes? Now, at the time, a lot of Americans looked at these people at first as being, or older Americans did, as being cowards. This is the Vietnam War generation, are the sons and daughters of the World War II generation. And the World War II generation is the sons and daughters of the World War I generation. So the idea was when your country called you to fight, you fought. Nowadays, looking back, a lot of people would say that these people were not cowards and they were heroes for standing up for their beliefs. Because I know a lot of people who were able to avoid the war and they thought at the time the war was the right thing. When they look back and they go, wow, I'm sure lucky I didn't have to be a part of that thing. Right. And keep this in mind, even though young people are beginning to protest against the war, two-thirds of Americans still support the war. An overwhelming population of Americans still support the war in 66, right? Remember, 1964, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the vote was nearly unanimous in Congress to go to war and to stop communism, right? Why are so many Americans still support the war, even though the majority of young Americans are against the war? And the answer to this is, I just said it a little earlier, is a lot of Americans still have the belief, right, from World War II and World War I, when your country calls on you to fight, you fight. It's part of our freedoms in America and standing up for the flag and standing up for our ideas. Also, in 1966, remember, a lot of Americans believed we're fighting for the Vietnamese. We're fighting to stop the spread of communism. Communism was a real threat to the United States, so we thought there was the threat of nuclear war from Russia, right? And the threat of communism spreading around the world was seen as a threat to the United States. That's the domino theory, right? So a lot of Americans are still thinking we've got to fight against communism to save the Vietnamese and save Southeast Asia from communism. So what we get out of this now is the counterculture movement, right? The infamous hippie movement, right? And what's interesting to think about this counterculture movement is why all of a sudden does the 60s take this radical turn in America? It's very much like the Civil War. There's before the Civil War and there's after the Civil War. And when the 60s, there's a way America was before the 60s, and there's a way America was after the 60s. And after the 60s, America is going to become a lot more open and liberal, and a lot of those conservative ideas from before the 60s are going to dissipate quite a bit. So, what is it in the 60s that allowed young people to galvanize together and create this change? Well, the first one is the protests and the draft, right? The Vietnam War had a draft. Now we've only had drafts in Civil War, World War One, World War Two, and shortly after World War Two during peacetime, right? But this is a draft where you're being forced to fight in a war that's not to protect the sovereignty of the United States. You're being sent 12,000 miles away. So for a lot of young people protesting, right, the idea was the longer this war goes on, the more likely the chance is that I will have to fight in Vietnam, and fighting Vietnam is a threat to my life. Another thing is these young people grew up in the affluent society and they saw their fathers going to work every single day, right? Who would go to work and wear a suit and work in a cubicle and take a train home and drink when they got home to relax, right? And a lot of young people saw this kind of a lifestyle and said, I don't want to be like my father. He's white collared. Yes, he's making money, but he's not satisfied. He's unhappy. He's bored. And then for women, right? Women are reading the feminine mystique. And the idea of women have to be housewives and the goal in life is for women to get married and have kids. A lot of young women at this time are saying, no, wait, why can't I go out and have fun? Why can't I be my own person? Right. So a lot of young women are rejecting the idea of being a housewife. And lastly, an important thing that's going to allow young people, young hippies to really protest is the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement is happening just ahead of this anti-war demonstrations, right? And what the white protesters learned from the civil rights movement, and many of them were part of the civil rights movement, is they learned how to organize. They learned that when a group of people speak up and protest, that change can happen. So these anti-war movements are going to take the playbook of the civil rights movement and apply it to the Vietnam War. Now, part of this countercultural movement is drug use, right? And drug use back then was not seen as, yeah, man, let's just all get high all day long and play video games, right? It was seen as a way, really, for a lot of young people to open their mind and see things differently, right? That's one way of looking at the war, right? Rather than looking at the way from the prism your parents see it or the country sees it. What's a different way of looking at it? Now, keep this in mind about using drugs in the 1960s, right? People didn't really not know the consequences of long-term drug use, right? There had been drug use before. In fact, the drug scene began with the beat movement in the 1950s. There was a small group of white artists and poets and whatnot who were using drugs, and they were copying what black jazz musicians were doing. So there was drugs before, but it was a very, very small population doing it. Now the difference is going to be there's going to be a national population of young people taking drugs on a wider scale than ever before. So the first thing to keep in mind is that people didn't recognize the consequences. Another one is the types of drugs they were taking, right? It was primarily marijuana and LSD at this time. Not really cocaine, not really heroin, not really more physically addicting drugs, right? But marijuana and acid, right? Now, one of the people that's going to help to popularize the idea of taking drugs to expand your mind is going to be Timothy Leary, right? Now, he's a Harvard professor who experimented with LSD. In the 1950s, there were government research projects designed to see what the effects of LSD could be on the brain and if it had psychological effects that could help people or what kind of behaviors it did. So Timothy Leary took acid and basically said, this is great, right? A short story is people used to say, people who take acid don't go get a gun and go out and shoot people, right? His thing was, this is something people need to take and recognize that there's an alternative out there. And he had an expression, turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? And the idea was to turn on to the scene, turn on to the time, tune into what's happening with young people standing up for themselves, whereas a scene would be the organization men and corporations, and then drop out of high school, drop out of college, drop out of work. You don't have to be part of the machine. Now, analyze why might young people be attracted to this message? And the answer is the life of the 1950s, as we just mentioned, with the feminine mystique and the organization man of you go to college and make money and conformity and money will make you happy did not appeal to this group of young people who are very much at risk of maybe possibly dying in Vietnam, right? So a lot of young people are attracted to this message because you know what? In the 20s, some people are looking at going to war. And drugs are bad. Drugs might kill you. Well, so might AK-47 when I go to Vietnam, right? So what's the point of me not going out and having a good time before I have to go to Vietnam, right? So a lot of young people trusted this message more than the message coming from the government or from their parents or from corporations. Remember, as I said, a lot of people did not know the consequences of drug use yet. At the same time, there's going to be a sexual revolution. It's going to happen in the 1960s, where there's going to be more openness about sexuality. And why does this happen in the 1960s? What is going to be the game-changing reason why there will be a rise of promiscuity in the United States? And it's going to be the birth control pill is invented. For the first time ever in American history, women can take a pill and not get pregnant. Whenever any generation had sex, women usually bore the consequence of having sex with possibly getting pregnant, and getting pregnant would end any future prospects of what they might want to do in their life. Now, women who choose to take the pill can have sex and not worried about an unwanted pregnancy, right? So, women were just as free as men to have uh, multiple sexual partners if they wanted to. Now, with the hippies, though, and here's a difference too, is a lot of people say, well, that's it. Sex is supposed to be something between people. Well, for the hippies, right, sex was used as something that was actually more beautiful. It was casual, it was recreational, right? It was also they were open to interracial relationships, and homosexual relationships were accepted, right? And this is at a time when interracial marriages were illegal in many states in the South, and homosexuality was also illegal in many states, right? Because keep in mind, right, the protests that the young people are doing against their parents and older generations is America's always looked at sex as being dirty, as being sinful. We're a very Puritan nation, right? It was for procreation, making babies, not recreation, right? And we were definitely against interracial and homosexual relationships, right? So the hippies are the first group that are open to saying, hey, if it contains love and it makes you happy and it makes other people happy, what's wrong with happiness? Now, 1968. This is the year that's going to change the war in the United States. All of a sudden, Americans are going to start questioning, why are we in Vietnam? Do we really need to fight the communists? And the number one event that's going to happen is going to be the Tet Offensive, right, in 1968. Now, every single year, there would be a ceasefire around Tet, which is the Chinese New Year, essentially, right? And the idea was the Vietnamese would say, hey, can we take a ceasefire for a couple of days? And the Americans were like, hey, you mean you want to take a vacation from fighting for a week? That sounds like a great idea. In 1968, though, during this ceasefire, enemy forces in South Vietnam, as you can see on the right there, every single red star, the Viet Cong and Communist forces launched a coordinated attack against every single American base in South Vietnam. It is the largest battle of the war. The images you see on the upper left there are images in Saigon, which was supposed to be the most secure city in South Vietnam. In fact, the U.S. embassy was overrun until Marines took the embassy back, right? And the reason why this was so important because this the U.S. did win the battle. We did not lose a single base. But all these images were broadcast on television, and it changed the U.S. opinion of the war, right? Americans started to doubt the government. For 4 years, the government's been telling America, we're almost winning, it's almost over. We just need more troops, we just need more troops, right? And by this time in 1968, there's about over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, right? So a lot of Americans are starting to doubt, right? So explain, what was it about the Tet Offensive that finally started convincing Americans that Vietnam war was unwinnable? And the answer is World War II against Hitler only took 3.5 years. And this is already 4 years in. And it seems to be that after the government's been telling us the America's winning, actually 4 years in, you get the biggest battle of the whole war. The enemy, the communists, the Viet Cong, are obviously not losing their strength. They're just as strong, if not stronger than they've ever been. So when are we going to get out of this war? So the second thing that happens in 1968 is you get the presidential election. And President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is the president that got us into the war in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, has recognized that the war has become such a failure that he decides not to run for re-election as the Democratic presidential candidate. So Robert F. Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, decides to run for president as an anti-war candidate. And it looks like he's going to get the Democratic nomination. He wins the California primary, right? And this is a charismatic young politician, just like John F. Kennedy. You can see the images there. That's him in the upper left breaking bread with Cesar Chavez. That's Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King in the lower left corner there, right? Young people supported him, and he's promising to get us out of Vietnam. He is assassinated after the California primary in the Ambassador Hotel over his policies on Israel. It had nothing to do with the Vietnam War. It had nothing to do with him being a hippie. It had to do with something completely different in foreign policy for the United States. Then, 2 months after Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated, Martin Luther King is assassinated. And both these assassinations shock America, right? These are, right? And what is it about these two assassinations? They are going to tear this country apart. Americans are going to be deeply affected by the deaths of these two people. Why do you think that? What makes these two men different? And the thing about these two men is, at a time when young people are starting to distrust the United States government and distrust American society and not see the best in America, these are two people who preached the best of the United States. They preached nonviolence. They appealed to minorities. They appealed to whites. They were trying to get Americans to believe in themselves again. And the reward for that was they died, right? And Americans are looking at this going, wow, if these two benevolent people can be killed, what's going to happen in the future if anyone else tries to come in here, right? So a lot of Americans get very pessimistic and they go, my gosh, things are actually going to get worse. And one example of that is the Democratic National Convention. Now, in Chicago, because Robert Kennedy, who looked like he was going to be the nominee for the Democrats in the presidential election, is dead, it went to the convention to decide who was going to be the Democratic candidate against the Republicans. Now, keep this in mind. The Republicans are in favor of the war. Whoever is going to run for the presidency for the Republicans is going to say, we need to stay in and we need to keep fighting. So if you're a young person and you don't want to go to Vietnam, you're going to vote Democratic. And what the Democrats do is they nominate Hubert Humphrey, who is a pro-war candidate, as the Democratic nomination. And this is important because now, if you're a young male against the war, because you can get drafted, how do you feel or react about Humphrey's nomination? Who do you vote for? If you're anti-war, who do you vote for? And the answer to this is there's no anti-war candidate. The Republicans support the war, the Democrats support the war. So you don't have a choice in 1968 to vote to end the war. And what ends up happening is Americans start burning stuff. We have the Chicago Seven, which are members of the Student Democratic Society, and they lead riots that break out in Chicago outside of the convention because the Democrats have not nominated an anti-war candidate, right? And on television, the police are sent in to break up the riots using very, very harsh tactics. So in the next episode, we will look at, well, then who's the Republican candidate and what's going to happen next to end the war. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you guys soon.